And good evening once again. Day 72 of the Biden administration, and there is new bombshell reporting about Florida Republican Congressman and Trump acolyte Matt Gaetz. This week, the New York Times broke the story that the Justice Department was investigating Gaetz for sex trafficking involving a 17-year-old girl. Well, tonight, the Times is back on the board with a new report that, quote, a Justice Department investigation into Representative Gaetz and an indicted Florida politician is focusing on their involvement with multiple women who were recruited online for sex and received cash payments. Investigators believe Joel Greenberg, the former tax collector in Seminole County, Florida, who was indicted last year on a federal sex trafficking charge and other crimes, initially met the women through websites. Mr. Greenberg introduced the women to Mr. Gaetz, who also had sex with them. Mr. Gaetz denied ever paying a woman for sex. Katie Benner, you have no less a task of explaining this story, especially this update to our viewers tonight. Do I read it correctly that the allegation is, and someone has indeed seen the receipts, that young women were paid via Cash App and Apple Pay?
That's correct. We've seen receipts of payments to two different women by Congressman Gaetz and his friend Joel Greenberg. I believe what the men would say is that the payments would be something for other than sex. The women would say that, in fact, the payments were for sex, that they had sexual relations with both men.
Now, how does this all come together? This story started out, the initial headline that people might have seen was an investigation into the congressman for allegations of sex trafficking. The congressman countered with an elaborate story about his father wearing a wire, an extortion attempt. Now, you and Mr. Schmidt come in tonight with this further detail about what may be the congressman's private life and where it might intertwine with ethics considerations, if not the law.
So I think that we need to separate the extortion allegations from this investigation. I think there's a possibility that two things can be true. You can be both the victim of the crime and you can both be the subject of an investigation into a possible crime. So putting aside the extortion for a moment, which is something that began only last month. This is a months-long investigation. It began under Attorney General Barr and under the Trump administration. People were looking at Joel Greenberg for a variety of infractions, and one of the things that investigators found is it was very likely that he had had sex with a 17-year-old girl. Now, when they executed the search warrant for his possessions, they also found evidence that showed that Congressman Gaetz was, if not involved, certainly aware, and they continued to dig. It led them to Congressman Gaetz. It led them to information about these arrangements that had been initiated by Mr. Greenberg on websites where he would reach out to women and meet them, and then he would introduce them to the congressman. As a part of those arrangements, the two men would have sex with these women. The women would get paid. The women say that the payments were for sex. They had spoken with the FBI about these encounters. And one of the big issues when you look at legal liability is whether or not the congressman also slept with with a girl who was 17 at the time.
Professor, over to you. A couple of points. Everyone's innocent until proven guilty. At the same time, none of this looks good. The congressman is one of the most bombastic members of the House of Representatives. The congressman is engaged to be married. But to you, the question becomes, what is the legal jeopardy on how many fronts that he is facing?
Soliciting sex workers is typically a state, not a federal crime. So if it's just that Gaetz has on his own solicited people for sex in exchange for money, that's not a crime that federal prosecutors would be interested in. It's a case for the Florida district attorney. But as Katie has reported, Gaetz is reportedly being investigated for violating federal sexual trafficking laws in a case involving a 17-year-old. That is a serious federal crime. And there may be a separate investigation of someone who's allegedly trying to extort Gaetz and his family to make the Justice Department investigation go away. Even if that's true, Brian, it doesn't shield Gaetz from criminal liability. Gaetz can be the perpetrator of one crime and the victim of another. But Gaetz really has to be worried about this third investigation of Joel Greenberg. That's the Florida official and good friend of Gates, who's already been indicted for child sex trafficking. And the reason Greenberg is a problem for Gates is because he's violated his bail. So he's locked up in jail in Florida pending his trial. He's got a lot of incentive to cooperate in an investigation of Gates. The feds have already probably come calling to Mr. Greenberg in his Florida jail cell to see what he knows about Gates and if he wants to make a deal.
Ashley Parker, with thanks for your patience, over to you. While your beat is the White House and not the House, you have been known to cover all of Washington with ease. So here's the question. What will this mean for Gates standing in the House, at least short term? What does it mean for House leadership, Kevin McCarthy, and the party overall?
So Gates was someone who did not have a ton of allies in Congress to begin with, even among Republicans. He was, as you pointed out, a bombastic and a very vocal Trump ally. So he did have allies and support in that sort of MAGA world. But what you're seeing now is there's not that many people rushing to his defense. There's very few people, in fact, proactively defending him. You know, this is someone, when you mentioned leadership, who flew to Wyoming to participate in a rally against Liz Cheney because she had voted to impeach President Trump. And you saw McCarthy in an awkward situation where he basically said he was not going to strip Gates of his committee assignments yet. He's waiting to see what happens, but he basically said the allegations were very troubling. And if any of it proves to be true, Gates absolutely would be stripped. So it's not the sort of circling of the wagons and vociferous defense you want from members of your own party. And this is at the beginning, and it looks like, at least according to Katie and Mike's fantastic reporting, that it is going to get worse for Gates, not better.
And Katie, over to you. Other than people refreshing your byline on the New York Times website, what is supposed to happen next in this case, according to your understanding of the investigation?
I think the investigators are going to continue to try to reach out to as many of the women involved as possible. Of course, they're also going to look at other allegations, including the fact that witnesses have told them that they used drugs when they would have these sexual encounters with the men, because that could also complicate legal questions for the congressman. I do feel like it's fair, though, as part of this segment, to read Matt Gaetz' entire denial in full. He says, his office says Matt Gaetz has never paid for sex. Matt Gaetz refutes all the disgusting allegations completely. Matt Gaetz has never, ever been on any such websites whatsoever. And Matt Gaetz cherishes the relationships in his past and looks forward to marrying the love of his life. So I do want to say, put in his full denial, because he very, very much adamantly pushes against these allegations. We just know that these are things that the FBI has learned from witnesses.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.